Hey guys, Rob from Georgia here with you, aka VHS 82 apostrophe, with yet another edition of my Something Weird, Just a Thought, which I have been able to throw anything and everything underneath this broad umbrella of sorts, including readings from H.P. Lovecraft, which we are really just about in the very midst of, about to start our third episode, Six Shots by Moonlight. Which, of course, comes from H.P. Lovecraft's Herbert West, Re-Animator. Initially, 1922, was written in 6 separate segments and given to a new publication of sorts, Home Brew, which I just learned today, reading a little deeper, that it was somewhat of a humorous magazine. So why Mr. Lovecraft was asked to write for it a horror piece, maybe the authors or the editors were just trying to broaden their audience just a little bit, or giving them something a little bit different. But it did get me to thinking. I was a little standoffish to Stuart Gordon's presentation of Re-Animator as he gave it to us in 1985, with, of course, Jeffrey Combs and Barbara Crampton, and Bruce Abbott, of course, leading off. Right. I was a little standoffish by the amount of what seemed to be over-the-top humor. I know much black comedic humor, but still, nonetheless, being familiar with the work and Lovecraft work in general, I was a little bit put off. But in terms of Re-Animator, and I've sort of gotten over that. But thinking on Home Brew and it being a sort of periodical or pulp piece for humor, got me to thinking to maybe I need to look even harder for those comedic moments that we do find in Lovecraft from time to time, even if they're not intentional. But I don't know if anything Lovecraft wrote was not intentional. So the 6 episodes, this is from I Am Providence, The Life and Times of H.P. Lovecraft, S.T. Joshi, page 412. He gives us a little bit of a summary of the 6 episodes, and I won't read it all in its entirety, but I will use it from here on out, just as a reminder in where we're headed. The 6 episodes show West producing more and more hideous instances of reanimation. In the first, West injects a serum in a corpse, but it seems to produce no results. The 2 doctors bury the corpse in a potter's field, only to learn later that it came to life after all. In the second, West impiously decides to resurrect Dr. Alan Halsey, who, as head of the medical school, had vigorously opposed West's experiments and had died in a typhoid epidemic that raged through Arkham. The creature is caught and locked up in a Sefton asylum. In the third piece, 6 Shots by Moonlight, which we will be into very shortly here, West and the narrator have set up a practice in the small Massachusetts town of Bolton, which, by the way, is a real place, I learned today, although it was not a factory-driven community, as Lovecraft will create for us. An attempt to resurrect the body of a black man, an amateur boxer named Buck Robinson, otherwise known as the Harlem Smoke. I will add an addendum. I feel necessary. There is one piece of this story that, being that our time is such removed as it is from the time of Lovecraft, it does perhaps maybe come across with a bit of awkwardness. Look, I am not about to temper myself in terms of what I read or how I Well, I shouldn't quite put it like that. Obviously, there's always some temperament going on when we read things of the past and how we may apply that today in our own lives. But I think it is unfair that Lovecraft, in some circles at least, has garnered the reputation that he has as a result of um, who he was in the time that he lived in. Anyhow, I'm talking way too much. I did want to start, though, this episode with a quote that I came across, again, looking at Reality and Knowledge, short essay by S.T. Joshi from his Lovecraft and a World in Transition. The quote again is from our hero Crawford Tillinghast from Beyond, 1920 piece or story by H.P. Lovecraft. And I do find it interesting and maybe made applicable to what Herbert West is or is striving to be. Crawford said this: "What do we know," he had said, "of the world and universe about us? Our means of receiving impressions are absurdly few, and our notions of surrounding objects infinitely narrow. We see things only as we are constructed to see them and can gain no idea on their absolute nature. With 5 feeble senses, we pretend to comprehend the boundlessly complex cosmos, yet other beings with a wider, stronger, or different range of senses might not only see very differently the things we see, but might see and study whole worlds of matter, energy, and life which lie at hand, yet can never be detected with the senses we have." And I find it applicable in the sense that Herbert West is one who, where Crawford had created a device that allowed him to peer into worlds that he ought not to have, probably. Lovecraft, well, yeah, as an extension of his imagination. Herbert West looks to, perhaps with benevolent outcomes in mind, looks to overturn the natural order via a serum that he has created to reanimate life. He is striving to stand in the shoes of the Creator and cast somewhat of a much longer shadow, I guess, is one way of putting it. So I find that, and these are relevant, continuous themes throughout much of Lovecraft's works that spill over onto one another, overlapping one another. Again, Herbert West, Re-Animator, originally published under the title Grewsome Tales in Home Brew, Volume 1, numbers 1 through 6, February through July 1922. And as I read Part 3, 6 Shots by Moonlight, if you're not familiar with this story, keep in mind the time period one is writing. Keep in mind that we can't really understand one's perspective and why they choose to write as they write, but there's so much to enjoy from Mr. H.P. Lovecraft that I would never in a million years think of tossing his works by the wayside simply because of perceptions others strive to build up. For what reason or end, I don't know. Herbert West, Re-Animator, Part 3, 6 Shots by Moonlight. It is uncommon to fire all 6 shots of a revolver with great suddenness when one would probably be sufficient, but many things in the life of Herbert West were uncommon. It is, for instance, not often that a young physician leaving college is obliged to conceal the principles which guide his selection of a home and office. Yet that was the case with Herbert West when he and I obtained our degrees at the Medical School of Miskatonic University and sought to relieve our poverty by setting up as general practitioners. We took great care not to say that we chose our house because it was fairly well isolated and as near as possible to the potter's field. Reticence such as this is seldom without cause, nor indeed was ours, for our requirements were those resulting from life work distinctly unpopular. Outwardly, we were doctors only, but beneath the surface were aims of far greater and more terrible moment. For the essence of Herbert West's existence was a quest amid black and forbidden realms of the unknown, in which he hoped to uncover the secret of life and restore to perpetual animation the graveyard's cold clay. Such a quest demands strange materials, among them fresh human bodies, and in order to keep supplied with these indispensable things, one must live quietly and not far from a place of informal internment. West and I had met in college, and I had been the only one to sympathize with his hideous experiments. Gradually, I'd come to be his inseparable assistant, and now, as we were out of college, we had to keep together. It was not easy to find a good opening for two doctors in company, but finally the influence of the university secured us a practice in Bolton, a factory town near Arkham, the seat of the college. The Bolton worsted mills are the largest in the Miskatonic Valley, and their polyglot employees are never popular as patients with local physicians. We chose our house with the greatest care, seizing at last on a rather run-down cottage near the end of Pond Street, 5 numbers from the closest neighbor, and separated from the local potter's field by only a stretch of meadowland, bisected by a narrow neck of the rather dense forest which lies to the north. The distance was greater than we wished, but we would get no nearer house without going on the other side of the field, wholly out of the factory district. We were not much displeased, however, since there was no people between us and our sinister source of supplies. The walk was a trifle long, but we could haul our silent specimens undisturbed. Our practice was surprisingly large from the very first, large enough to please most young doctors, and large enough to prove a bore and a burden to students whose real interest lay elsewhere. The mill hands were of somewhat turbulent inclinations, and besides their many natural needs, their frequent clashes and stabbing affrays gave us plenty to do, but what actually absorbed our minds was the secret laboratory we had fitted up in the cellar, the laboratory with a long table under the electric lights, where in the small hours of the morning we often injected West's various solutions into the veins of the things we dragged from the potter's field. West was experimenting madly to find something which would start man's vital motions anew after they had been stopped by the thing we call death, but had encountered the most ghastly obstacles. The solution had to be differently compounded for different types. What would serve for guinea pigs would not serve for human beings, and different specimens required large modifications. The bodies had to be exceedingly fresh, or the slight decomposition of brain tissue would render perfect reanimation impossible. Indeed, the greatest problem was to get them fresh enough. West had had horrible experiences during the secret college researches with corpses of doubtful vintage. The results of partial or imperfect animation were much more hideous than were the total failures, and we both held fearsome recollections of such things. Ever since our first demonic session in the deserted farmhouse on Meadow Hill in Arkham, we had felt a brooding menace in West, though a calm, blonde, blue-eyed, scientific automaton in most respects, often confessed to a shuddering sensation of stealthy pursuit. He half felt that he was followed, psychological delusion of shaken nerves, enhanced by the undeniably disturbing fact that at least one of our reanimated specimens was still alive, a frightful carnivorous thing in a padded cell at Stephen. Then there was another, our first, whose exact fate we had never learned. We had fair luck with specimens in Bolton, much better than in Arkham. We had not been settled a week before we got an accident victim in the very night of burial, and made it open its eyes with amazingly rational expression before the solution failed. It had lost an arm. If it had been a perfect body, we might have succeeded better. Between then and the next January, we secured 3 more, 1 total failure, 1 case marked muscular motion, and 1 rather sugary thing. It rose of itself and uttered a sound. Then came a period when luck was poor. Interments fell off, and those that did occur were specimens either too diseased or too maimed for us. We kept track of all the deaths and their circumstances with systematic care. One night, One March night, that is, however, we unexpectedly obtained a specimen which did not come from the potter's field. In Bolton, the prevailing spirit of Puritanism had outlawed the sport of boxing, with the usual result: surreptitious and ill-conducted bouts among the mill workers were common, and occasionally professional talent of low grade were imported. This late winter night there had been such a match, evidently with disastrous results, since two timorous Poles had come to us with incoherently whispered entreaties to attend to a very secret and desperate case. We followed them to an abandoned barn where the remnants of a crowd of frightened foreigners were watching a silent black form on the floor. The match had been between Kit O'Brien, a lubberly, now quaking youth with the most un-Hibernian hooked nose, and Buck Robinson, the Harlem Smoke. The Negro had been knocked out, and a moment's examination showed us that he would permanently remain so. He was a loathsome, gorilla-like thing with abnormally long arms which I could not help calling forelegs, and a face that conjured up thoughts of unspeakable Congo secrets and tom-tom poundings under an eerie moon. The body must have looked even worse in life, but the world holds many ugly things. Fear was upon the whole pitiful crowd, for they did not know what the law would exact of them if the affair were not hushed up, and they were grateful when West, in spite of my involuntary shudders, offered to get rid of the thing quietly, for a purpose I knew too well. There was bright moonlight over the snowless landscape, but we dressed the thing and carried it home between us through the deserted streets and meadows, as we carried a similar thing one horrible night in Arkham. We approached the house from the field in the rear, took the specimen in the back door and down the cellar stairs, and prepared it for the usual experiment. Our fear of the police was absurdly great, though we had timed our trip to avoid the solitary patrolman of that section. The result was wearily anticlimactic. Ghastly as our prize appeared, it was wholly unresponsive to every solution we injected into its black arm, solutions prepared from experience with white specimens only. So as the hour grew dangerously near to dawn, we did as we had done with others, dragged the thing across the meadows to the neck of the woods near Potter's Field, and buried it there in a best sort of grave the frozen ground would furnish. The grave was not very deep, but fully as good as that of the previous specimen. The thing had risen of itself and uttered a sound, and in the light of our dark lanterns we carefully covered it with the leaves and dead vines, fairly certain that the police would never find it in a forest so dim and dense. The next day I was increasingly apprehensive about the police, for a patient brought rumors of suspected fight and death. West had still another source of worry, for he had been called in the afternoon to a case which ended very threateningly. An Italian woman had become hysterical over her missing child, a lad of 5 who had strayed off early in the morning and failed to appear for dinner, and had developed symptoms highly alarming in view of an always weak heart. It was a very foolish hysteria, for the boy had often run away before, but Italian peasants are exceedingly superstitious, and this woman seemed to as much harassed by omens as of facts. About 7 o'clock in the evening she had died, and her frantic husband had made a frightful scene in his efforts to kill West, whom he wildly blamed for not saving her life. Friends had held him when he drew a stiletto, but West departed amidst this inhuman shrieks and curses and oaths of vengeance. In his last affliction the fellow seemed to have forgotten his child, who was still missing as the night advanced. There was some talk of searching the woods, but most of the family's friends were busy with the dead woman and the screaming man. Altogether, the nervous strain upon West must have been tremendous. Thoughts of the police and of the mad Italian both weighed heavily. We retired about 11, but I did not sleep well. Bolton had a surprisingly good police force for so small a town, and I could not help fearing the mess would somehow ensue if the affair of the night were ever tracked down. It might mean the end of our local work, and perhaps prison for both West and me. I did not like those rumors of a fight which were floating around. After the clock had struck 3, the moon shone in my eyes, but I turned over without rising to pull down the shade. Then came the steady rattling at the back door. I lay still and somewhat dazed, but before long heard West rap on my door. He was clad in a dressing gown and slippers, and had in his hands a revolver and electric flashlight. From the revolver, I knew he was thinking more of the crazed Italian than of the police. "We better both go," he whispered. "It wouldn't do not to answer it anyway, and it may be a patient. It would be like one of those fools to try the back door." So we both went down the stairs on tiptoe with a fear partly justified and partly that which comes only from the soul of a weird small hours. The rattling continued, growing somewhat louder. When we reached the door, I cautiously unbolted it and threw it open, and as the moon streamed revealingly down on a form of silhouetted there, West did a peculiar thing. Despite the obvious danger of attracting notice and bringing down on our heads the dreaded police investigation, a thing which after all was mercifully averted by a relative isolation of our cottage, my friend suddenly, excitedly, and unnecessarily emptied all 6 chambers of his revolver into the nocturnal visitor. For that visitor was neither Italian nor policeman. Looming hideously against the spectral moon was a gigantic misshapen thing not to be imagined save in nightmares, a glassy-eyed, ink-black apparition nearly on all fours, covered with bits of mold, leaves, and vines, foul with caked blood, and having between its glistening teeth a snow-white, terrible, cylindrical object terminating in a tiny hand. Thus ends Part 3, 6 Shots by Moonlight. The third piece in Herbert West, Re-Animator. Yeah, there was one thing I thought about here on our way towards the end. If you remember, about 7 o'clock in the evening, she had died, and her frantic husband had made a frightful scene in his efforts to kill West, whom he wildly blamed for not saving her life. Friends had held him when he drew a stiletto, but West departed amidst his inhuman shrieks and curses and oaths of vengeance. In his latest affliction, the fellow seemed to have forgotten his child. This guy who blames Herbert West for the death of his wife does awfully remind us of the lieutenant from Bride of Reanimator, who blamed West of his wife's unfortunate demise, whom, though, West turns the tables on him and suggests that the reason for her death wasn't anything he did. It was the fact that this lieutenant had beat her. And in fact, a great line a little bit later on comes when he tells Dan, shoot him, he is a wife beater. Use the gun. Just great. So another neat little moment. Now, I did say I wanted to add one small addendum to one paragraph in particular. Something S.T. Joshi said in I Am Providence, The Life and Times of H.P. Lovecraft. I think it was here, page 414. Joshi, and I agree with his notion of this. He said, "I do not know whether much need to be made of the apparent racism in the third episode. Buck Robinson is described as a loathsome gorilla-like thing with abnormally long arms, which I could not help calling forelegs, and a face that conjured up thoughts of unspeakable Congo secrets and tom-tom poundings under an eerie moon. The latter part of the sentence is so extravagant that I again suspect parody, and interestingly, far from affirming the doctor's belief that the serum prepared for white patients would not work on a black corpse, the resurrection of Buck Robinson actually establishes the reverse." So that's interesting. And also, too, it's just not Buck Robinson. He has a snide remark for it. It's the Italians in their overbearing or superstitious nature, and how quickly they're quick to jump on the supernatural or unbelievable or whatever it may be. So it's not just, an isolated moment here in a story, but yeah. So anyways, part 3, and then I guess we will move on to part 4. Anyways, if you're following along, thank you very much, and do please comment in terms of how I chose to go about all of this. I'm curious. Anyhow, as always, we end these things off with Go Bills.
This is Not a dream. Not a dream. We might be useful